Welcome to Eschatology Matters, part of the Fight, Laugh, Feast Network. I'm Jacob Tanner, and we want to encourage you to read more of the Puritans. Want to start reading the Puritans, but don't know where to begin? Puritan Treasures for Today from Reformation Heritage Books makes the riches of these godly writers of old accessible for the modern reader. With updated language and helpful introductions, these classic works from John Owen, Jeremiah Burroughs, and more are the perfect starting point for the curious reader. Learn more about the Puritan Treasures for Today at heritagebooks.org/Puritan Treasures. Again, that's heritagebooks.org/Puritan Treasures. And guys, you know what? If you want 10% off your order, you can now use code EMatters. Again, that's code EMatters for 10% off your entire order. I think it's the entire order anyway. I shouldn't have said entire order. I think it's entire order though. Try it. See what happens.
Maybe they'll honor it since we said that on the thing. Funny thing about Puritans, 80% of the people who love Puritans have never read Puritans. Tuck that statistic away somewhere. It's true.
Is that a true statistic?
Yeah, no, that's an actual verifiable statistic. No, I just made that
verifiable.
Up. I just totally made that up, but I bet it's close to true.
I believed it.
Yeah. So we're on Eschatology Matters. Jon is letting us intrude onto his normal purview. So Jon, you do kind of a weekly roundup, news stories, and also just things of the week that are happening. That comes out weekly. What is it? Thursdays? Remind me what day that is, Jon.
We kind of shifted around, kind of looking at like Mondays, start moving forward. I think it's going to be a new idea. So
perfect. So catch Jon on Mondays, but we're joining Jon on. Well, it doesn't matter what day it is because it's probably not going to release today anyway. But we're joining Jon on an off day and just chatting through some of these things. It's funny because I was telling our church, this was like January, and I'm an encouraging guy. So I was trying to prepare our people by like, hey, it's going to get weird this year. So, prepare accordingly, read lots of scripture, hold your children tightly type thing. It's gotten significantly weird, and we're still in July. So lots to talk about. We wanted to cover a couple of things today and at least encourage people to think along good biblical thinking lines and how this connects to that whole big story. But yeah, Jacob, you want to lead us into one? We'll get rolling on some of these topics we discussed.
Yeah, I think probably the main thing that we want to start with today is the story of the attempted Trump assassination, and specifically what I want to talk about for a little bit related to this whole thing that happened, without getting into any of the conspiracy theories. It's not right off the top anyway. I do want to talk about the fact that there are very particular news sources that were right away trying to bend and twist that story through their headlines to make it sound like something else entirely was going on, something else entirely was happening. And of course, anybody that knows the actual story, there was an attempted assassination on former President Trump, possibly President Trump again this year now also. But they attempted to kill him, to shoot him, and only by the providential grace of God was his life spared. And it was a very clear attempted assassination. Like, there was no doubt in anybody's mind. If you saw the videos, especially, I know some people that were there, it was very clear a man was shot and killed. There were terrible things happening. But these are some of the headlines that were put out. CNN, for example, initially wrote, Secret Service rushes Trump off stage after he falls at rally. There's absolutely no way to think that's what actually happened, and yet that's what the headline initially read. Or the Indy Star and other USA Today outlets said Trump removed from stage by Secret Service after loud noises startles former president. Startles former president. Or Washington Post said Trump taken away after loud noises at rally. And then others just tried to twist it completely, like Newsweek put out a statement or a headline that I think they deleted that says MAGA responds with outrage after Donald Trump injured at Pennsylvania rally. And I didn't save this one, but I even saw another one earlier today. So we're recording this on July 16th. Earlier today, I saw a headline that conservatives now saying you're next to Democrats after what happened at Trump rally. So although the Lord has providentially protected us from a potential civil war that would have erupted, there's definitely still a lot of twisting of news that's going on. And I think that's an interesting place for us to begin. This twisting of the news, this twisting of events. And there's a couple of more things that I'd like to say about it, but I'll turn it over to you guys and see what are your thoughts? Why are they doing this?
Yeah, I'm going to hand it off to John pretty quick, I think, because I know, John, you've got some thoughts on this. But I see a couple of things that are worth like at least recognizing. You see several people have pointed out like you don't hate the news media enough, that sort of thing. That's probably a good warning. There's in my mind, there's at least like two dynamics that I think we as especially as ministers should really caution against, or just as Christians should caution against. One of them would be to trust. Well, just to throw it out there, if you have a distrust of news outlets, which you should have kind of a reflexive distrust of what you see from the media in our day and age, especially in our country. But it can lead you into a sort of solipsism, where just any sort of epistemological knowledge outside your own mind is unattainable or unsure at least. That's a risk for people in our day and age. We're bombarded with so much ostensibly raw data from our phones. It's usually through a filter, right? It's usually data that's actually been kind of twisted and massaged a bit. But still, you've got a whole lot of real-time information, and at the same time, you don't trust most of it. That leads people into a really tricky spot with navigating real-time events. The second thing, though, is just to recognize that people know that they're part of a sense of narrative. And so when you're talking about stuff like news reporting, you're being told a false narrative. And when you look to the younger generations, especially, you're seeing a retrieval, with all the like retrieval of neo-paganism and all the sort of mystery religions that are kind of being unearthed from the depths. There is a yearning for a narratival center, a place in story. When we have that distrust of the news media and when we're fed false stories, we're either believing a false story or we're learning to distrust the story itself. And I mean story insofar as like the narrative of history. So just thinking like, just from an eschatological perspective, from a biblical perspective, that's a big risk for a generation that's coming up with cell phones in their pockets and they hear events like this. There's a lot of reactions they're going to have that I, as a 40-year-old, am not having, at least not as immediately. But John, what are you thinking and seeing from this?
Yeah, I think this idea of narrative is super important. Obviously, journalists are trying to constantly contextualize all that they're seeing. And so it's very interesting. I think there's almost like a very similar dynamic between how this story was initially covered and how the Biden-Trump debate also was covered. I think there's a narrative of Biden is, he's still got it. He's sharp as a tack, I think was a quote that people were using. And so then when everyone saw Biden's performance in the debate, we knew that narrative was a joke. And they realized at that moment they cannot control the narrative anymore. So with Trump, he constantly uses language like, they attack me, but they're going after you. And they're saying, oh, what a ridiculous statement. What a ridiculous statement. I think Tucker Carlson even made a comment about how they could potentially even like assassinate him. And people are like, what a crazy claim that anyone would ever try to do this. So then when a clear assassination attempt happens, I don't think they have the wherewithal and the narratival kind of structure to be immediately able to just acknowledge a clear truth. Like if you watch the video, and I'm assuming if you have any journalist integrity, the first thing I would do before writing it is just to watch a like 1 minute, 2 minute clip of like shots fired, hand grabs it, falls down, confusion, more shots fired, people get around him, bleeding on his face, carried off, with the big fist, like all these epic moments. You would see all of that and be like, oh, that's clearly shots and fire. At the very least, is it what it appears to be, right? You would never say something about like, oh, he falls down. You would never say something like, oh, he was scared. You would say, this man got shot at and clearly standing up, at a podium, this is a clear assassination attempt. And so I think the reason they struggle to say that is because they've been weaving a narrative that's so false to reality that when something so obvious happens, they don't actually have a good response to it. And that's why I think for Christians, we need to be aware of having this. There's a saying that's really common going around on Twitter. Saying from the Bible about the sons of Issachar, knowing the times. And I think that's something really important for us Christians to be aware of, is what's really happening. And I think moments like this should hopefully shake us all up to realize there's a level of, I think, like a fever pitch intensity in America that's got into not just a political level, but a religious level. There's religious zeal and fervor. There's zealots on sides wanting to bring about through murder, right, accomplish political means. And I think having that in mind realizes how do we contextualize the gospel? So when we talk about Great Commission and we talk about all these different things and we talk about the influence and the importance of Christ's authority in all places, we have to realize that this isn't just something we say, but it really doesn't make a difference. It's something we could just say and, but still be friendly. There is a war going on, right? And Jacob mentioned this idea of civil war, and it's hard to say what that will look like. I am probably of the opinion, and maybe I'm wrong on this, that it would be a very cold civil war. There'll probably be flashes of violence here and there, but I imagine most of this will be done behind the scenes and that sort of thing. But there clearly is a group of people who hates a portion of Americans, and specifically Christians. I think that's something to be aware of. Again, I'm not making any claim about where Trump's spiritual state is, but I think he does represent a lot of like Christian values to the broad American, to the kind of his political enemies. Ideas of loving our nation. His ideas of obviously he's wobbled, and maybe we could talk about his wobbling with the kind of pro-life abolitionist movement. But he signals a lot of those things. And I think as Christians, we need to be aware of like, okay, this is a fight that we need to be a part of. And it shouldn't be too surprising that an assassination attempt happened. I think if you were like, whoa, I could never believe this could ever happen in my generation, I think you just haven't been paying attention.
Yeah.
I think that idea of narrative too is one of the really important things for us to understand, because there is a narrative, and let's be clear, the narrative is on both sides. It's not like one side over the other. There's very clear twisting of truth, twisting of information that's taking place. But as I was reading through those things, and I'll have to thank Brandon for actually posting this online as well. But he reminded me of this quote from 1984, where it says, "In a way, the worldview of the party imposed itself most successfully on people incapable of understanding it. They could be made to accept the most flagrant violations of reality because they never fully grasped the enormity of what was demanded of them, and were not sufficiently interested in public events to notice what was happening. By lack of understanding, they remained sane. They simply swallowed everything, and what they swallowed did them no harm because it left no residue behind, just as a grain of corn will pass undigested through the body of a bird." And he also says at another place in 1984, "The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command." And 1984 is one of those things where he didn't get everything right. I think we're living in a combination of 1984, Brave New World, and some of C.S. Lewis's idea as well from the Space Trilogy. But anyway, regardless, this narrative twisting that's taking place is definitely a page out of 1984's totalitarian party running everything. And we have to be aware of the fact that when they're provoking us with these narratives, what they're trying to do is basically either gaslight us or make us think that we're the ones who are crazy for seeking after truth. Basically what they're doing, a lot of these news sources, the most popular ones, sort of, if I could use the term mainline and compare them to mainline denominations for a second, what they're basically doing is they're saying, if you don't believe our narrative and you think that there's another truth out there, you're basically Alex Jones, and you're one of the worst conspirators around. But this isn't conspiracy. What we want to do, what we ought to do, especially as Christians, is we ought to seek the truth, because the truth is good, the truth is beautiful. And even when it's really ugly, like it is now with the attempted assassination, we still have to be aware of it, because as you were saying, we need to know the time. And Josh, I saw you wanted to say something.
I'm keying up. I just got to jump in with you because it's talking about narrative. So like one of the things we've gotten the chance to do, and especially like the younger generations have gotten a chance to do in the last couple of years, is see massive narratival shifts in real time. So you had COVID come out and all the aftermath of COVID. You had people saying several different things during COVID that were immediately labeled as like nonsensical, and these must be, edited off YouTube. Some people were like, "Hey, I think this came from a lab in Wuhan. That's hate speech. That's clearly false information. Your
How
show's
dare
off
you?"
YouTube." Right.
Yeah.
And then like not even 3 years later, they're like, "Oh yeah, we think it actually did come from that lab and we're not going to retract anything." So like a lot of people have gotten to see that of like, okay, we've been fed a false narrative and then penalized for rejecting the false narrative, right? So, you brought up the Space Trilogy. So you've got that poignant scene where, I can't remember the guy's name now. In
Ransom.
No, 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 not ransom. I'm thinking of that hideous strength where he's being made to step on crucifixes and defame religious objects.
Started.
Yeah,
Man.
stuttered. Anyway, whatever is that, we'll find it in a minute. John sleuthing over there. So, but you've got him being made essentially to confess things he knows to be false, right? Like this is kind of the final step in the psychological breakdown. Do you have that name, John?
I'm pulling it up.
Still pulling it up, man. Okay, never mind. Sorry, I saw you pull it up. Yeah, but you've
Mark
got him.
Studdick. That's it.
Thank you. Everybody go read the Space Trilogy or the Ransom Trilogy. But
I
you've
gotta
got him
read it
being
again because I
forced
couldn't
as
think of the name.
yeah, it's so good. But you've got at the end of it, it's kind of like that final stage of his kind of psychological reforming or his breakdown. Really, they're psychologically torturing him, and he's being made to confess things that he knows to be false. Many have pointed out like this is the day and age in which we live. You present yourself to me and say I'm a woman, and I'm looking at you knowing that that is not factually true or creationally true. And yet I'm expected to then confess something I know to be false. So there is a narratival battle that's going on. The reason that matters a lot for Christians is not just if you're bookish and have, as Jacob and I do, the massive bookshelf in the background. John has one. It's just hidden. We were talking about that before the show, but it doesn't just matter in the fact of storytelling, right? Like we as Christians are telling a story of narrative and of what God is accomplishing. We're in the middle of an election season where things like abortion are going to come up, and we're going to be telling people babies matter because they're actually a part of something, and God has stamped them with a design that is important and given them inherent value in the story. Sacrificing narrative is not just we lose a little bit of the flavor of Christianity. You're losing the message with which we are proclaiming the gospel to people. And that's why it's such a critical mass for Christians to understand that narratival psychological warfare that is being
I have a term for it that I like.
Yeah.
I've been calling it narratival gaslighting.
I like it.
That we're being gaslit. And speaking of narratival gaslighting, if you're worried about that, I think we have a sponsor that Josh would like to tell you about.
I'm glad you brought that up, Jacob. Boniface Media, actually, it's a streaming platform from Grace and Truth Press. Boniface is offering 50% off to 200 subscribers for the life of their subscription, unless that subscription is canceled or payment lapses. So if you'd like to take advantage of that offer, head over to boniface.com. That's BONAFICE.com and enter the codes alpha test or beta test to apply a 50% discount and avoid narratival gaslighting. Boniface Media.
Yeah. Shout out to Mark too for spelling the name wrong. We appreciate it, Mark.
Yeah. No. Well, what else do we think about this? Because I think one reason I'm coming right to you, John. I think one of the reasons like people might be unfamiliar with this. I realized something just as a pastor a couple of years ago. I was making a killer illustration from World War II. And I realized that 90% of the people in the audience did not even know who fought in World War II. Mm-hmm. So they definitely didn't appreciate whatever the illustration was. But it is an unfamiliarity. Like I grew up reading the Gulag Archipelago and letters from.
Wait. You grew up reading the Gulag Archipelago?
As a 2-year-old, yeah. What'd you read?
Wow.
Yeah, no.
I was reading the Bible, only the Bible, man.
Oh, man, you juked me on that one. Okay. Bible and Gulag Archipelago. But yeah, familiar with these stories though of times of intense, not that long ago, psyops within Western culture. So I think a lot of people just they don't have that maybe historical understanding to the point where when they're warned about this narratival gaslighting, it sounds unfamiliar or sounds maybe outside the norm. But John, what were you keying up on there?
Yeah, one thing I want to do is because I think as Christians we all kind of get like, oh, there's evil happening in the world. But I think one portion that I think this becomes a very specific incident that we need to be thinking through more broadly, even eschatologically, is how do we view this evil, right? Because you could view this evil, in my opinion, as kind of there's really two, I feel like, tales of eschatology that are being told right now. One that is a kind of negative view of where the world's going to go. It's going to get worse and worse and worse. And so here, people would say this is clearly it moving in this direction. And yes, it's horrible. Yes, we should say it's horrible, but we shouldn't be surprised and we should expect it to keep getting worse from here. But then there's another narrative of, hey, this evil needs to be pushed back because ultimately evil won't triumph, right? The church will continue to be successful in its preaching. And we should see this as a downturn, as something that we need to buck against in order to push back and see kind of a change of hearts and a renewal. And I think the two different narratives that you would use around that really changes how you will push back in these moments. Either you would say, well, this is what I've been telling you. I've been telling you since, back in the 60s when I saw the sexual revolution, it's been all moving in this direction. And this is just what we should expect. And to think anything otherwise would have been foolish, rather than thinking here's evil and then we need to like rout it out of our country and have a kind of bold take on it. Honestly, this is why I like, again, whether you agree with the whole implications of Christian nationalism or not, Stephen Wolfe, kind of one thing he kind of argues is we need to have this kind of consciousness of Christianity to push back against it. Because if we just say, oh, the world is going to hell in a handbasket, then you see all of these events and you just feel affirmed in your position and you say, okay, well, this is what I expected. And so you don't really feel any need of pushing back. But if you see America once had these great Christian values that are being taken away, and it's like seeing in your family or in your church, this decay, you would want to fight back for it. Like, let's get back to where we were. Let's turn back, back to the old faith that we once had, turn back to the old paths. And I think that is what's a narrative that we need to be fighting for in our conversations right now, of not just well, this is where the world's going to go. And so that, I guess that's just, that's where we're at. We still do our faith thing. We still do our evangelism thing. But of course, politics and all this, cultural roles are always going to go in this direction. I think that kind of stymies a lot of activity that I think we need to be more involved in as Christians. And again, NatCon happened recently, a National Conservatism conference, and seeing both, I think, Al Mohler and Doug Wilson shake hands, that picture that went pretty viral around Twitter. I think there's clearly a Christian impetus of saying Christianity, and there's a question that was asked by the moderator about, he said he would go to these Christian colleges, and he's a Jewish moderator, and he was saying a lot of Christians kind of push back saying, I hear that you're talking about these conservative values and I agree with them, but as a Christian, shouldn't I be focused just on the church and evangelism and that side of thing? And both Al Mohler and Doug Wilson, I think, rightly said, if you make your Christianity a small little personal thing, right, that is not the Christianity of the Bible. The Christianity of the Bible is this universal perspective on seeing that the gospel would change all types of relationships and roles. And I think right now,
I think not to interrupt you, but I just got to throw this in there. I think what you're describing there, even that question itself, is really the result of what we were kind of force fed for almost 2 decades straight of just the gospel, man. Nothing but the gospel, just the gospel. And what they meant by that was just share the gospel with others, but they took it a step further, right? It wasn't even just share the gospel, like boldly go out and proclaim, thus saith the Lord. It actually shifted even further into build a relationship, build a bridge between you and that person, build a relationship, establish a friendship, and then over a period of time, you might have a chance to share the gospel with them in a loving, compassionate, acceptive, and even inclusive way. And I can remember hearing this stuff when I was a kid at like youth conferences and stuff, right? Where they would say, you just got to build that bridge. You got to establish that relationship. And not once was I ever told at one of these conferences that, hey, if this God is real, and he is, and this gospel is true, and it is, then you got to go out, you got to boldly proclaim it. And by the way, it's going to absolutely shift and change everything. It's going to change an entire culture. And so not even considering the NACON stuff, but just also considering what we were talking about with narrative and having actually an eschatology that speaks to these things, a truly Christian worldview. I think this is the difference between the ending of something like 1984, spoiler alerts for all 2 people that haven't read 1984 at this point, but it ends on a very, very sad note, very depressing note, where the main character has not only been brainwashed by the party, but the story basically ends, I think, with them implying that he's been killed as well. So they get him to accept what has happened, and then some take it that he was actually killed at the end also. So complete failure on behalf of the hero. But then you look at another story, and I'm either going to date myself or alienate the majority of listeners right now, but there was this Christian band called Project 86 from a number of years ago. I think they're done as a band, but they just released their final 2-part album called Omni. If you care at all about Christian sort of heavy, what do they call it? Christian heavy music, because you're not allowed to call it heavy metal, right? Christian heavy music, then listen to Omni Part 1 and Part 2, because it talks about a totalitarian society. And spoiler alert, the story actually ends with the totalitarian society being taken down by God himself. So I don't know if they're post-millennial. The albums definitely sound that way. A lot of their songs sound post-millennial to me. But anyway, it's that Christian worldview. It's this hope that the party, or whether you want to call it the liberal side of things, or whether you want to call it the godless goons, like I like to do now, they will ultimately be defeated in the end. That is a worldview that is not going to last into eternity. But the Christian worldview is one that will. So what I want to do, John, is I want to go back to the whole NatCon, but also, you know what? I want to focus broadly on the conservative party right now. And I want to throw this idea out there at the both of you and let you talk about it for a moment, because I've been talking for a while now.
Well, I was thinking about something, Jacob, before you get into that,
Yeah,
because
go
with
ahead.
NatCon, but like if one was looking for encouragement, in a time of, let's just say, a time of hardship, you're looking to maybe great heroes of the faith, maybe guys with funny hats, and looking for encouragement from them in a time of persecution. Is there something like, where would you direct somebody who's looking for resources on that sort of thing? I'm looking for your plug. Are you not holding your book still? You had
You
a
want me
book
to?
that just came out on this. I'm
oh,
trying to set you up here, Jacob. Come
wait,
on, man.
I wasn't sure.
You got
I
a
thought
good,
that's what you were doing, but
you got a
then
good, encouraging book. Why wouldn't we talk about that at this point
okay.
in the episode?
Hey,
There you go.
Wait and Hope, Puritan Wisdom for Joyful Suffering. It just was released through Reformation Heritage Books, so really excited about that. I don't know where it's available exactly right
It's
now.
on
It
Amazon,
will.
because I just checked.
Oh, is it now?
It
Okay.
is.
So we're getting there. This is kind of like, I guess you would call it, it's been softly released. We haven't started like really plugging it in media things yet, but
I
it
think
is
all of my
available.
books have been very softly released. That's a term I'm going to
Yeah.
start using for just
Yeah. So that's
under
how
the
I like to
radar.
refer to it. Soft release. Nobody knows that it's out yet.
Yeah.
But
Right
now
up
you
my
will.
alley. Yeah.
Now you will. So really what the book's trying to do, and it actually, believe it or not, does speak to our current cultural climate. It's divided into multiple chapters and multiple Puritans I talk about as well. And really embracing this idea that we as Christians can suffer with joy. We can suffer with hope. We can suffer with steadfast long suffering in Christ, because Christ is our great treasure, and we know he's ultimately victorious. And so the book is actually has some sections that are overtly post-millennial, but you don't have to be post-millennial to read it. In fact, you don't even have to be Christian to read it, because the gospel is explained throughout. So if you're not a Christian, pick it up, and I pray you become a Christian. But if you are a Christian, my prayer is that this will encourage you. Really, whenever I write anything, I write it primarily for my church. And then if it seems good enough, like they're like, hey, other people would benefit from it too, then I might turn it into a project. And that was really where this came from. It was this idea of just seeing suffering going on in our church, seeing suffering in the families in our community, suffering in my own family when my dad was dying. And so this was kind of the byproduct of all of those different things. So if anybody would like to check it out, I'd really appreciate it. Wait and Hope, Puritan Wisdom for Joyful Suffering.
Awesome. No, thanks for that, Jacob. But I interrupted you because you were kind of directing us back to, oh, help me out here. You were directing us back to NatCon and
Yep.
some of the developments there. You said you're trying to broadly frame it though, insofar as like the state of the party. Was that what you were getting at?
That's what I want to go into, but we don't have to go there yet. If you guys have other things
Well,
to
there's one thing I
talk
would
about.
want to say.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is that there's no such thing as Christless conservatism.
Hey, you took
I
my
want,
line.
I want pin that topic right there. That's fresh and new to
John
me.
is the first person I've heard
Yes.
say that. So
Oh, man.
when I quote it, that's what he's going to be.
You'll just say
Yeah.
it's John.
It'll be
Yeah,
like a
anytime
Martin
it says-
Luther
and it
quote.
says
You have
Christ
no
is
idea if he
conservatism.
said it or not, but he's got the name after it. Yeah.
Yeah, you gotta reference me, or you might get a plagiarism.
Or you could pull the Michael Scott if you're an Office fan.
Yeah, yeah, Wayne Gretzky.
There you go. No, that's where I wanted to go with it. The whole
Yeah.
you can't have Christless conservatism. And I wanted to flip it over to you guys and see what your thoughts are on that. Because one of the things that I've noticed over the past few years is that we, as Christians and as conservatives, often will go and we will appeal to Christless sources so long as they seem to push our agenda forward. And I think that that's a big mistake. And I
Yeah.
think that that's part of what has put the Conservative Party where it currently is. I said on one of our previous Eschatology Matters episodes that I think the Conservative Party, the Republican Party as it exists now, is about 15 years behind the Democrat Party in that it's really just moderate liberalism. That's all it is. We see that Trump, and John, you were talking about this earlier, I think. Trump is kind of wishy-washy on the whole abolition of abortion thing. And there's a lot of brothers and sisters in Christ who will now refuse to vote for him for that very reason, because they're not going to vote for a candidate, no matter the case. They're not going to vote for a candidate who is not entirely against abortion in every single way imaginable. But then you also look at some of the things that happen, and we were talking about this before, how they had basically like Hindu prayers happening or something, or there was a Muslim
Like
prayer. I
Sikh
forget
or
what it.
something like that,
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That only happens with a Christless conservatism.
Yeah.
And my argument is, and I'm actually working on an essay about this very thing. I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about it yet, so I won't go into too much detail on it. But I'm working on something in regards to this, that conservatism without Christ is ultimately just liberalism gone wild. So you can go with that whichever way you two
Yeah.
want, but I would like to
Let's-
get your thoughts on it.
Yeah, it's interesting because you've got, the National Convention. So you had a lady who I understand was, I think, the founder, or at least promoter of something called Slut Walk, and so she's up there doing her thing, and then like you said, you had a Sikh prayer to a pagan deity, to a demon essentially, and
Mhm.
you have conservative Christian candidates that were gathered there with their heads bowed and eyes closed, while this is going on. So it's always one of those moments of reflection. This isn't exactly new. I know John Harris has mentioned that a few times recently, that this isn't unprecedented, this sort of kind of acquiescence to what we see as popular movements. It is interesting the way the conservative movement in general has gone. So I was listening to, I think it was CJ Engel was on, I think he was on Chase Davis's podcast, but they were talking about this concept that he's been promoting of heritage Americanism. And it was interesting, at least insofar as I was really interested in his tracing some of the quote unquote conservative movement, or just the political movements within the U.S., specifically post World War II, and getting into some of that post World War consensus that I know is kind of a flashpoint on Twitter, but I think it's worth considering. How is it we're having a conservative party where most of the time I'm not sure what we're conserving, and I don't think that the conservatives that are gathered there to conserve are oftentimes very interested in it. That to me was one of the kind of shining moments of seeing Mueller and Doug Wilson on stage together, was not just the handshake and the ability to link arms with somebody that you might not have expected maybe 15 years ago, but also the fact that I'm pretty sure I know what those men are conserving or seeking to conserve, right?
Mhm.
It's commonly identifiable. That doesn't mean there's not substantive differences, but I can see to what they are trying to conserve. I think if there is a conservation movement within the Conservative Party, I think that's been lost. But I go back to what you were saying, Jacob, as far as the Christless conservatism. That's one of those things that I think Christians should very easily accept, and there's a whole variety of reasons why we don't do this. I think a lot of it's tied. Anyway, the point being that we should be able to readily accept the fact that there is no conservatism without Christ, that Christ is that anchor and that thing for which all these other things flow. I think the reason that Christians are so apt, especially in our day and in 2024 in the West, to reject that is that Anabaptism has won the day by and large in American Christianity. And when you have an Anabaptist outlook on that, and I'm not saying that as some sort of smear, I mean genuinely an Anabaptist leaning with your political ideology, it seems almost blasphemous or at least improper to talk about Christ in comparison to a political movement like conservatism. So what do? You bifurcate the two, and you try to have a political sphere that is merely influenced by Christian beliefs, and you wind up with what we saw at the
If it's
gathering.
even influenced.
If it's
Or
even
you
influenced,
just-
yeah.
you just remove
Ostensibly
Christian.
influenced, right?
Yeah.
It needs to touch down somewhere, but God forbid we talk about Kuiper's pro reggae. That sort of thought process, right? Like just kind of a vague, catching something on the wind. But John,
Yeah,
thoughts?
I think if you haven't listened to it, I highly recommend everyone listen to Doug Wilson's talk at NatCon. He does a really good job talking about if we're trying to get to the secular world, and what he means by that is not a godless or Christless secularism, but he made a distinction between the ecclesiastical world and the like public world. And those are different spheres, right? They have different roles and different, leaders and authorities and different tools, right? The state will have the sword, where the church will have the keys, things of that nature. If you want to get back to a, strong, virtuous, secular world, well, then you need that virtue to be founded upon something, right? And this is the classic C.S. Lewis abolition of man, right? You castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful, right? You tear down the tree and say, where's the fruit? And so this is where I think you're 100% right, Josh and Jacob, about this idea of Christless conservatism. Again, I think this might be another Doug Wilson quote of, Christless conservatism is just liberalism in slow motion, right? I mean, look at how they view same-sex marriage, right? Look how they view inclusion of multiple religions, how they view this idea of inclusion, right? All these kind of language is very much like almost 90s Democratic Party positions,
Yeah.
right? And so we were just seeing this kind of happen all in slow motion. And the reason why we need Christ is because Christ is, the Alpha and Omega, is something that does not change, right? So if you attach your conservatism to anything, right, that's not God, well, that embedded is a change in corruption, right? I think this is kind of the almost epistemological importance of God, is that he is who he is, right? And that doesn't change. And so everything else, there's a danger of shift and decay and corruption. And that's why, again, I think I'm thinking about Augustine and all these people talking about like finding, our identity in God and being rested there. And so I think when we're talking about all these different topics and trying to get back to this, robust Christianity, you talk about Anabaptists. And I remember hearing from one of our favorite people on X, I won't say the name, but they probably could guess, where they're pushing back against, a robust view of immigration that needs to say, how do we think about our nation and the dangers of importing immigrants who are contrary to the fundamental virtues and beliefs of America? And it's like, well, that's the Great Commission. Isn't it great that these, pagan demon worshippers are coming to your neighborhood and to your pools, right? This is the Great Commission. And I saw this, and I was even talking to my wife about this, is there seems to be a divide where identities could have been, I am a Christian in the church and I'm a Christian in my nation. And I've heard someone disagree with that division and say, no, it should be, you are a Christian and you are a citizen. And it's so interesting. We should immediately realize that's a silly divide, implying that my Christianity is only in one area and not in my role as a citizen or my role as an employee, right? And this to me is really the fundamental issue that conservatism needs to figure out, is if we want the virtuous, if we want good, orderly citizens, if we want virtue back in our system, if we want order, the question is, well, where do you get that fruit from? And you have to go back to the tree that is Christ. And this to me is why, again, Christianity is so important. And one thing I would like to say and kind of ask maybe to get your guys' thoughts on this is, I've heard this often, is evangelicals and even Reformed Christians, these ideas of influence in the culture, we seem to have a very poor job in actually being part of those conversations. And I wonder if there's this weird, maybe Anabaptist, you described it, Josh, influence of, by being actively engaging in those things. Like, look at the Supreme Court. How many evangelicals are there on the Supreme Court, right? How many people are there who would be kind of on our position on Christianity, right? It's mainly Catholics and one Episcopalian, right? So you have this really lacking influence of really probably the majority of conservative movement, this kind of like white evangelical voter, right? How much are they really influencing that? And I think there's a love of us needing to take more seriously roles outside of maybe the ecclesiastical traditional norms.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think you're right on that. And a lot of guys have pointed that out lately, which I'm grateful for, is that we've definitely imbibed the assumed, because usually it's not taught. Usually this is kind of just this, I think this is usually just something by way of implication, that we have imbibed this view that wielding authority or power is inherently wrong. It's okay for someone else to do it, but it's certainly wrong for a Christian to knowingly do it, or to do it maybe with Christian intents. And it usually gets framed in sympathetic categories. So it's like, well, if God wants to change the nation, God will change the nation. And that sounds good at first glance. Then you think to yourself, well, God uses means to accomplish his ends. Like, that doesn't exactly check out.
No. You know how he's going to do it? DEI.
Is that right?
That's right.
It's
I'm
settled.
surprised. Count me surprised. Yeah. Yeah. So, man, you just derailed my whole thought. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, just the ways, but you guys understand this dynamic, right? It's just power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Therefore, we should probably just reject any power, and it's probably the best if like the church is just like almost starving to death and relegated to the corners of society. And it's like, does that even number one? Is there any biblical command or prohibition that leads me to that conclusion? And the answer is absolutely not. I'm encouraged to do many things in Scripture to guard myself against the temptations of the world or being diverted off of the path that God has called us to, for sure. But never am I called to just like seek obscurity and a lack of influence in the world. So then you have to ask yourself, well, then what does that look like for the Christian? And that's where a lot of people, I think, are finally realizing, oh, it's actually good when we have Christian lawmakers. And in fact, many of us are riding the coattails of a whole lot of Christians that did not have those beliefs 50 years ago. And we're starting to realize what it looks like without those things. This is the whole walking with your parent. They're protecting you, under the umbrella, and you think, mommy's, she's stemming my behavior and I'm going to be free and independent. And you step into a puddle and get lightning struck and realize, I was actually much better with mom. We've been riding a lot of that detritus from that wreckage for a long time. And I think we're finally starting to realize, number one, it was unwise to leave it in the first place. But number two, we actually have a task that God has called us to in this world.
So I'm going to throw what's probably a controversial idea out there.
That's not like you.
No, I never do that.
That's unusual. Okay.
I wonder how much of this sort of escapist fantasy that a lot of Christians seem to engage in, especially when it comes to sort of political behavior, how much of it relates to the stories of missionaries that we've been told who go out into rather obscure areas. And we have, for the past however many years, we've heard about the 1040 window and how there are cultures and there are tribes that have not yet heard the gospel. And I guess my difficulty is I wholeheartedly believe they need the gospel. I wholeheartedly believe that those tribes that are unreached need to be reached because Christ is Lord over them too. But then I also think that we can almost get carried away and we go, well, if you're not a missionary going to the most obscure part of the world, then you're not really serving Christ. And if you get involved with something like politics, well, then you're too worldly, you're too earthly, and you're of no heavenly good. And I don't think that's the proper balance either. I think we really need to figure out within our churches where the balance lies. And I think that what we'll find a lot of the time is that the mission field for a lot of us is not across the world. The mission field for a lot of us is just our community. Yeah. It's our culture. And that's what we need to be working on. That's what we need to be speaking to.
Which is why, I hope Christians coming off, for example, like after the failed Trump assassination, a lot of Christians said things from their pulpits for which I'm very grateful. Most of them called their people to prayer. I called our people to prayer. I think that's good and right. I think we should also call them to action, and not some sort of unwarranted or unwise or ungodly action, but still an action of like, hey, you should probably go home and there's like real tangible ways in which you can fight the darkness in your community, in your home, in those circles that God has given you, but a call to action nonetheless, because anything that bifurcates us from the world in those regards, I think would be unwise in that moment. But John, I know you've got to probably run. Is there anything we want to wrap up with? We didn't touch on half the things we were going to, but we touched on several we should. So anything to kind of close the thoughts out?
Yeah, I love the idea of a call to action. So certainly prayer. I think sometimes we say that and like, oh, of course, pray, but prayer is the way that God has ordained that he will act in this world through prayer. We've seen prayer do amazing things. Daniel prays for the 70 weeks and God gives him a vision of when Christ will come to the earth. I think prayer is a lot more powerful than sometimes we remember, because there are people who just say prayer only, right? But I don't want to do that. So we do need to pray. And I think we need to be united in prayer across many types of churches. I know Jonathan Edwards wrote this great little book, a little pamphlet about praying for revival. And it's a great book and about all these different groups praying. Because ultimately we agree, we want heaven to triumph over hell. We want God to triumph over evil, and we want the church to triumph over wicked men. And so we need to be praying for that. But I do think the practical point is, I work, I'm not a minister, right? I'm a deacon on my church. I serve there. And so I'm involved, but my main duty and vocation is in real estate. And so I think about my place there is just pushing Christianity out. I just think about how we got to this place now where America's at is because loud people were speaking boldly and confidently about their position until the minority position felt like the normal position. We talk about the Overton window. Santiago Pliego has this idea about the vibe shift. And I think Christians just be aware of just speaking more publicly and boldly about Christian views will make change. When you're out in public, openly talk about Christian positions, right? Openly, rejoice in good Christian things of, marriage and kids and these sort of things. And I think the more we do these little moments like this, we'll see a boldness and an openness about Christian values and acknowledging explicitly that they come from Christ, not just trying to say, oh, this is just American values. No, these are Christian values. I think the more we do that, the more we'll see that the culture will have to respond to that. And by the grace of God, through our prayers, they will respond with repentance and faith.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Amen.
That's good. Well, John, Jacob, appreciate you guys. And it was great to be on chatting with you. And I'm sure there will be lots more opportunities for calls to action on the behalf of the church in 2024. So, yeah, just in the meantime, Godspeed and good to talk to you guys. Okay.
Amen.
Good seeing you guys.
Seated here at my right hand, the Lord to my Lord did command, for of these heathen I will make a kingly footstool for your sake.